Hello and welcome. I'm Ada Pembroke. I'm an astrologer and writer and the founder of the Narrative Astrology Lab. I am here with Tasha von Dinther of Astral Shores. She is a member of the Narrative Astrology Lab, and she is an integrative astrologer and spiritual guide who works with archetypes. She is brilliant. And there's a part of me, I was just saying this before we started recording. There's a part of me that wishes that this was video because like you would be able to see like the awe on my face after the conversation that we've had for like the last 20 or 30 minutes. But I'm also kind of glad that this is going to be audio only because I feel like I'm just going to spend this entire interview with my mouth open because I have been for the last half hour. So you are really in for a treat. Not to put a ton of pressure on you, Tasha, but as somebody who has Venus and Pluto and Scorpio, I think you can take it.
Unfortunately, yes.
So before we were talking about contrasts in our characters and in our charts. You have the sun in Virgo, and I have the sun in Taurus, and even though those are both Earth signs and they have a lot in common, there's a key difference between the two of them, which is the ability to handle complexity. I was talking about my husband who's very Virgo-ish and he's a data analyst and he puts together these spreadsheets that make my eyes cross and I'm just like, "Oh my gosh, that's so complicated. I cannot live in your world." And you were like, "Right there. That's where we need to start." So that's where we're starting.
Yeah, cannot live in your world is a great and interesting line for this placement and just for the complexity of our nature as humans, which is really what I think that this placement is about, that we're going to
Absolutely.
talk about. Yeah.
I probably should have introduced that we're talking about Chiron and Cancer, but if you've clicked to listen to this, you probably know that already.
Yeah, Chiron in Cancer, and in my case, in the 12th house. So,
This is going to go deep. So, one of the things that really stuck out to me before I record these conversations, I really like to spend some time with the Elements books by Stephen Forrest. They're one of my favorite sources for cookbooks. Chiron isn't in there, but there's a very nice section about Cancer in there. I was struck by this contradiction. He says that Cancer is profoundly motivated to avoid pain at all costs. And yet, Cancer is about feeling your feelings honestly and authentically. And I was thinking about this within the context of your Chiron and Cancer. And I was like, how do you navigate that contradiction?
yeah, and I think my answer was, well, to put it briefly, constant ego death. And to put it more
Oof.
complexly, um, the dichotomy and the oscillation in between the shell and the vulnerability and what it means to because cancer is actually about feeling, and cancer does actually have the awareness of the depth that feeling goes, which is actually the driving factor and why it does not always want to. And that's again that oscillation between shell and goo, between individual experience and consciousness, which is what I think this archetype really speaks of. So, what happens when we realize that we do not inherently belong here because this is but a piece of who we are, and yet we are here? So, Chiron and Cancer, Cancer speaking of family and belonging, and yet the non belonging that happens within that family here on Earth. So there it speaks of the wound, there it speaks of what you would typically think of Chiron in Cancer. But to take it a little deeper, it is that Cancer again understands that depth of feeling and what could be and what is, and also has the ability to feel it. And we do put up a boundary for a time until we realize that that boundary really isn't we can't continue to survive if we live within that boundary or that shell. And so we must outgrow it and we must become feeling. And this sort of dance between these two has a lot of wisdom in there because it sort of tells us what we're doing here in a lot of ways, even though this is a separate experience from the deepness of consciousness and from the belonging of consciousness. We are here to have this experience. And so there is within it the acceptance of pain in a lot of ways, which is the ability to feel it. Is there the acceptance that we are one, you know, and yet we have to figure out how to be both one and everything at the same time. That got kind of deep, but I hope I got what I was saying there. It's the 12th house. It's going to be esoteric.
I was making jokes about lanternfish before we started. I think I at
That's,
least was
that's
fully
my
prepared to go to the bottom of the ocean with this.
yes, exactly. It's going to go deep either way. Um, yeah, but it is that constant ego death and that want to desire love and belonging in its true form instead of what we sometimes find here on earth. And that is challenging, right? It's like, of course, Chiron in Cancer would represent the pain of family. I can say that from my direct experience, and that's what anyone would look at in that placement and sort of think. But it's like, well, what does that drive us to? If the family isn't the nucleus of belonging, what is? And I guess that's the question of this particular Chiron, right? It is asking us to go within the pain to find what is true. And since Cancer is the ruler of my Chiron, and the moon I have in Gemini, it is a discussion of truth. It is the quest for truth always and everywhere, no matter how deep you must go, and no matter how many times you must shed your shell.
That was beautiful.
Yeah.
And it made me think of what you said about we looked up the Sabian symbol for your Chiron before we did this. And you read
Yay.
it to me and you said that it was a man with a scroll. And I was like, if that isn't like the perfect description of somebody with a scroll for the moon in Gemini, like
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the follow-up to that was seeking completeness for total integration through intellectual process. And so, yeah, weaving that back in, this and with that thought again of 12th house, it is the culmination of what you find through feeling and integrating that in order to have an experience of truth. That is this Chiron.
wow.
Yeah.
I feel like I should just like mic drop and the conversation right here because those are such beautiful last words, but there's so much more we want to talk
Yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah. Let's keep going.
So, uh, if there's a theme to this series that I'm doing, it's kind of setting the record straight. And so, one of the things that we talked about before we started recording was I was like, okay, so, you when I asked you what you wanted to set the record straight about in your chart, one of the things that you said was Chiron. And I was like, so what's your critique of the stereotypical interpretation of Chiron and Cancer? And the stereotypical interpretation is wounds around family, wounds around belonging. Um, but I would love for you to reiterate what you told me about where you think we go wrong with the stereotypical interpretations of this placement.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I kind of jumped the gun and I answered that a little bit in the first ramble, but it is just simply that is meant to take us somewhere deeper. Um, to look at it and be like, oh, family problems. That would be an easy interpretation of that Chiron, but that is not the mission. And when we talked about the Sabian symbol, it is kind of a mission. It's not simply about an experience in some ways, even though it is all about experiencing, but it is an integration. It's an integration process, and that is, in my opinion, in all of astrology, that's what everything is trying to do. So I wouldn't say that this is so much a misinterpretation as a not going deep enough, which of course I would say, being Chiron
Mm,
and Cancer. But yeah, it is a question of the quest for cosmic belonging, for which there is no evidence. And yet we experience every day in our, or not every day, but in our lives every year, in our interactions with one another and with who we truly are. And that is what this planet and this aspect is going more deeply with.
that's so beautiful. You used the words belonging without labels earlier, and I just thought that was
Yes. Yeah, I guess
such a
that
beautiful
is
way to put it.
that is my critique. It is that when we look at it and we just say that it is a wound of family or a wound of belonging, that is in reference to the experiences and the labels that we give them here. And when it goes into Cancer and when it goes into the 12th house, these are water signs. It's about dissolution. It is about pure connection and pure consciousness. So, how do we find belonging without labels? How do we find belonging with ourselves, within society, with one another, within our lives, within the cosmos? How do we do that without labels? And I think that the answer is love. But, that's the quest. That's the quest of this particular placement.
It always does come back to love, doesn't it?
Yeah. Spoiler alert.
Oops. Oh well. Um, so one of the other things that we talked about was um you and I both agree that the wound of Chiron is is pretty much what people tend to think that Chiron means. Chiron is the wound and stop. That's it. But that isn't all there is to Chiron. And something that I like to harp on in my work is that, you know, Chiron's story begins with a rejection wound and it ends with a oops, I shot you by accident wound. But there's a whole life in between. And when I started researching Chiron's mythology, I was shocked to find that there are so many stories about the life of Chiron. And yet in astrology, all we ever talk about are the ones in which he's rejected or he gets shot. And so something that I've thought about a lot in my work is the question of, um, you know, after Chiron is rejected by his mother and um, he's adopted by the gods. And so if the symbols in our charts reference the whole story and not just these keywords that we pull out of the stories, what does Chiron mean if Chiron also points to the place in which we've been adopted by the gods? And so you've got Chiron in Cancer, which means that your Chiron is ruled by the moon in Gemini. And I would love to hear you talk about what that means to you, being adopted by the moon. Frankly, I'm kind of jealous.
I don't know. It's a little chaotic out here. I wouldn't be too jealous of it. Um, yeah, what's interesting that we didn't talk about the first time that I was smiling at when you were speaking about it is that the reminder that Chiron gets abandoned by the mother. And that's, hitting close to home sometimes.
Oh,
But what happens? What happens when we become abandoned? We probably build a shell around that wound,
yes.
but there is still the vulnerability underneath. And it is only the gods who can swoop up, or not swoop, however it happened, dive, swim down, whatever the gods are doing, um, to collect you because they know there is that vulnerability inside. And so it is this, what is that quote of, I think it's Terence McKenna quote that it's, this is the secret of the old mystics that they fling themselves into the abyss and find that it is a feather bed. And that sort of answers that question of cosmic belonging, but you have to do it by getting kicked out of the house by the cosmic mom, you know? Like the
Yes.
abandonment is, um, I don't want to say necessary requirement because not everybody has this placement, but it is a way to discover who and where you are truly meant to belong with.
Yes.
And the, the gods in my case with that moon in Gemini, yeah, it is loving because it's the moon, it's feeling because it's the moon, but it is also metaphysical because it's Gemini. It's out there, right? And so for me, as a lot of psychics will attest to, there has been a process of when you really want to connect to what you're actually truly connected to spirit, with, in my case, with this Chiron, that's where I have found my connection in the abandonment of sort of what you seem to appear to belong to in the real world. You find true belonging. And that has allowed me to open up my ability more to speak to spirit and to belong there and to give my gifts, which actually are coming from this high connection to, or sorry, this connection to higher self. And that's being scooped up by the gods, right? It's ending up back in your own arms, which doesn't that sound like the moon?
Oh, yes, it absolutely does. I think there's such an interesting parallel here between something that you've alluded to, and I don't think that we've actually like come out and said it yet, is there's this process with cancer that mirrors the life cycle of crabs of like, building this shell of safety around yourself and then growing within that shell of safety. And then the shell of safety is too small and you've got to shed it and grow a new one. And like, crabs don't have the privilege of snails of being able to just build another chamber onto the shell and just kind of spiral outward. It's like you have to completely abandon the old safety in order to build the new safety. And so, like, what is more abandoning the shell than a an infant, a newborn being abandoned by the mother? Like the mother is the first shell. And
Yeah.
yet that
Oh my God,
first
this is giving me
shell.
chills.
Oh, good. That means I'm speaking to your Chiron here. Um, But Chiron had to abandon that first shell in order to find the infinitely bigger shell of the gods, and then he just spent his entire rest of his life living within that universe-sized cocoon.
Well, God, I hope that's what happens to me.
May it be so. May it be
Yeah,
so. May it be
maybe so.
so.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's amazing. The relation, obviously, with the moon and Cancer and the crab and the cycles of the moon, and that was something that we talked about before as well, is this cycle of hardening and softening, of pain and integration, of challenge and like gifts, and it's like these things on this beautiful cycle, they it gives us such a clarity of how that actually happens. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's pretty. It's very much messy, but it does give us that awareness and hope that that there is something on the other side. And there are also, like, just looking at this for myself, now I understand why it's part of my mission. Now I understand why it is the mission. It's, if I have the ability to do this and make this visible and available, for others in the world, then that's a beautiful gift, right? When we're talking
Yes.
about what is the 12th house, I mean, I think I mentioned this before, but putting things to rest and dissolving. So, what is the pain that needs to be exercised so we can get to whatever is on the other side? And
Yeah.
that's all of what's going on here. So, we can understand that things happen in a cycle, so we can experience and become the evidence of that, not just experience that or evidence of that, but become it, really become it. And that is what Chiron did, right? The thing on
Yes.
the other side.
Yes. Yes. The pain isn't the point, it's just the vehicle.
Exactly.
Wow.
It still is pain though. It still does hurt.
Yes.
And that's the part of it being in Cancer
Yes.
is the awareness that it does in fact still hurt, you know, when we do it every time. I mean, I say every time because I feel like this has been a frequent event in my life. But it is a surprise every time because then it wouldn't really be a birth and a death, you know?
Yeah.
If you knew what you were doing, if it became old hat, then it kind of wouldn't, it's kind of not the point um, of the cycle.
Right. Right. It never gets any easier no matter how many times you shed your shell.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'll get a little bit more used to it and knowing your way, you know,
Yes.
knowing that it's part of what you're supposed to be doing allows you that trust. But it is
Right.
still mysterious being in the realm of the 12th house and Cancer and the moon. It is something that cannot be known.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That's just beautiful. So for the people who are as enchanted by your side of the conversation as I am, how can they find you? How can they work with you? Like, tell us about your practice.
Yeah, so all the regular places on social media, I am astral.shores. On TikTok, I am astral.tasha. I am most active on Threads if you have that.
Yes.
And I am, yes, you can find me on my website, www.astral-shores.com. And yes, I am available for readings, astrology readings. I do integrative astrology, working with the chart as archetypes that is supposed to help you build this kind of understanding and this kind of guidance in your life. So if that interests you, I would love to work out. I am also a psychic, and I have opened up my books to do Akashic readings. So speaking of cosmic belonging, that is very much what these readings are about. So if you're interested in that and dipping into your past lives and receiving guidance from your spirit guides, then I would love to help you with that as well. It's something I'm very passionate about, and it offers people a lot of healing and a lot of purpose to know their place. So that's the perfect way to summarize how this Chiron in Cancer is working for me.
Ruled by Gemini, the moon in Gemini, bringing that information forward from the mysterious night realms. That is so perfect for you and
Yeah.
your chart.
Yes, yes. And I would love to share that because it is that question of where we belong, what we belong doing. And I believe everybody has the ability and the right to answer that question and to feel the experience of that answer in their lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we are all blessed to have you helping us find the way. So I
Yeah.
really,
And
really,
also for those who are listening from the lab, I'm on the lab too, the Narrative Astrology Lab.
yes. And we are blessed to have you there as well. So
Oh,
I want to
yes.
thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about your Chiron and Cancer. This has been a great conversation, and I know I've learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Ada. This was a pleasure. And I can't wait to hear all the other conversations also.
We've had some really good ones, if I say so myself.
You can say so. Yeah, you should say so.